With me now is infectious disease specialist Dr. Anna Banerjee. Good morning. Glad you could be with us.
Good morning.
Lots to cover, as always. Let's begin with this announcement that we are looking towards from the federal government about funding for Indigenous peoples. Where are those funds needed most, and how might they protect vulnerable populations during this time?
So often the funding is divided depending on people applying for funding, and I think it really should be distributed across the board per capita. I think that's one of the big things because Indigenous communities have severe overcrowding. One of the big areas where they need resources is to build or to have mobile units or isolation units, because right now when someone gets sick in the communities, there's no place for them to go. And then the next major thing that I think that we've shown that we can put billions of dollars for this and that very quickly is we really need to fix the water situation in Indigenous communities. Chief Muniz has been talking passionately about how his community has been under water advisory since 1995. How do you manage a pandemic when you don't have access to clean water? So I think that, we can do it. We just need the political will to make that happen.
Yeah, I think that question is one that many people have asked. How do you manage day-to-day life outside of a pandemic, let alone during a health crisis like this? Ontario released some new modeling yesterday, but now there's growing frustration from many businesses that are saying, you should be sharing more information with us about where these cases are, where the transmission is occurring, because we're hurting. What do you make of that, and where do you see that going in the province of Ontario?
Oh, well, I think that restaurants are taking a disproportionate burden of, they're closed to keep us safe. Now, how much of the transmission was going on because of the restaurants? I guess they have their numbers, but I think that you could only keep things closed to a certain point because after a while, people are going to rebel. And I think that the modeling is okay when you're looking at the numbers and the factors right now. But, things have changed. For example, in Ontario or in parts of Toronto, you need to make an appointment to get a COVID test. So many people who would have gone in for COVID testing aren't getting tested. They're not doing contact tracing. So there's a lot of factors and variables that have changed. And the modeling is accurate when you have the same lockdowns in place. So if the variables change, then the modeling changes. And it's just an estimate based on the knowledge we have now. But I think our knowledge is incomplete, because we're not testing completely.
That's very interesting that you say that about restaurants bearing a disproportionate burden. What do you think about gyms?
I think gyms as well. I think for restaurants, all of us that can, we should try to order out and keep the restaurants afloat in any way. Gyms, I don't know if there's any way to support them, but I mean, COVID can be transmitted in any place where there's people indoors. And so how do we make it safer? I think for us to move on and then have certain sectors of our society left behind, it's challenging. And I think we have to be creative to try to find a way to support the gyms and the restaurants to stay open.
All right. Lastly, I want to ask you about Manitoba, because tighter restrictions might be coming in response to a rise in the case numbers. Is that the best solution?
I think that when you do have tighter restrictions and you keep people separate, it does seem to impact the COVID. It does seem to flatten the curve, but how long is that sustainable for? It's hard to know. One of the things I'd like to say is, what you just announced a little while ago, that 40% of COVID cases are linked to school. And I know that there are provinces like BC, Ontario, and now I think Saskatchewan is thinking about having kids go back to school with runny noses. So we're focusing on restaurants and gyms, but we're not even talking about schools. When we have kids are not being tested, so we don't really know how many kids have COVID. They're going to school. They're allowed to go to school with runny noses. And we know that COVID in children, it can present with runny noses. So I think that instead of focusing on certain areas that we continue to focus, we need to take a critical look at some of the real ways of transmission, which is schools, and changing to policies that allow kids to go to school with COVID, with the runny nose, when it's identical to the common cold, and then parents get it and grandparents get it. I think that's what we really need to start looking at.
Dr. Banerjee, great to have you with us on this Friday morning. Have a good weekend.